Without further ado, let me introduce you to Miss Alexandra Kalou-Christianaki, who is going to make us very, very small presentation of Luke. There you go, Alexandra.
Good morning and welcome to the second day of the 36th TESOL Greece Annual International Convention. It's a great pleasure to have with us today a major contributor to the ELT field. He's an ELT author, he's a teacher trainer, and he's an international speaker. He's been involved in the field of ELT for over 25 years. Today, he's going to talk to us about education and how educators can help shape society. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mr. Luke Meddings.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for that nice introduction. Here we are. Okay. That's the traditional at the start of any talk as the presenter tests the technology. Thank you so much. Thank you, TESOL Greece, for inviting me. Thank you for making me feel so very welcome. And thank you all for coming this morning. It's early on a Sunday morning, and I really appreciate it. This is the first time I've ever been to Greece. And it feels like a particularly exciting time to be here. Now, the conference theme is Teaching to New Heights. And I hope you've had your morning coffee, because without coffee, it's, in my experience, impossible to teach to new heights. And that's the message of my talk this morning. Actually, that's not the only message. But I hope the essence of what I say will be quite simple, or will become simpler as I proceed. I hope the message is simple because I would like it to be a message that spreads. And I hope that after spending an hour or so together here, you will want to help spread it. What do we mean by teaching to new heights? I guess we all have our own definition, but it must mean teaching to the best of our ability. We can't teach to the best of someone else's ability. And it must mean helping our students as much as we possibly can. This still isn't really defining the term, but it is at least addressing the idea of teaching to new heights in terms of our own classroom experience. If this is going to be a meaningful phrase, a meaningful expression, then we have to locate it in our own teaching. I often think that teachers are given rather abstract, almost alien notions of excellence. Teaching to new heights is lovely. But when I think of ideas like world-class teaching, have you ever heard that? World-class teaching. I feel a little suspicious because that's really a term borrowed from business. It's a kind of marketing term. And when I think of world-class, next bit in the collocation, I think of world-class facilities or world-class gym equipment. I don't think of world-class teaching. And it's worth remembering, I think, that we can't hit the heights all the time. Otherwise, we'd never come down to earth. Even the gods had to leave Mount Olympus from time to time. And if all teaching is outstanding, which is the word our national inspection body in the UK like to use, and which it wants all teaching to be, then it won't be outstanding anymore, because it won't stand out. It makes me think of the song from the Lego movie, Everything is Awesome. It'd be great if you could sing it. Oh, you so nearly did. You thought twice. I mean, the point about the song is that if everything is awesome, then actually nothing is awesome, because everything is the same. It's a kind of illusion. For me, hitting the heights actually means being fully grounded in the moment. So in a way, I'd like to bring that idea down to earth. It means really being in sync with the learners, working in time with them, reacting to their needs as well as answering their questions, and not being too particular or too picky about the timings. Because if we're going to work in time with the students, then that stops being our time and it becomes shared time. It's a kind of flow state where everyone in the room is fully engaged. It strikes me as the ideal environment for learning. And just like hitting the heights, it isn't possible to do it all the time, but it's something that we can strive for. I started out experimenting with this idea as a teacher. I taught in London for many years. Then in time, I started to write about it. And for the last 5 years, I've been exploring it as a teacher trainer. Gradually, it felt as though my ideas, because of the things I was seeing, the things I'm going to share with you today, it felt as if my ideas were moving away from education and into a kind of critique of society. But what I've come to realize is that you can't separate education and society. And the same ideas have actually brought me right back to education. They've brought me deeper into education and what it means to be an educator. Specifically to the idea of what it means to be in a classroom, in a physical classroom, with other people, in a school, in a community. And this morning, with the help of a little coffee and your patience, I want to share this journey with you. And I've divided this talk into 3 parts. The first is called Class Ceiling. And I'm going to share with you a little sort of mini dictation, I suppose. It's one of my favorite things to do in a classroom. I want you to imagine what the missing word is. So when I say blank, I want you to imagine the missing word. Don't shout out. It's possible you've come across this phrase. It's not my own. But just have a think. Here's the sentence. When I say blank, just ask yourself, well, what is that word? When it becomes a revolutionary act to blank, we're in trouble. When it becomes a revolutionary act to blank, we're in trouble. Just have a think, keep it to yourself, and we'll come back to it presently. Now, I don't know if you know the term glass ceiling. Who's familiar with the term glass ceiling? All women, okay. So, the glass ceiling is an invisible but tangible barrier, if that's possible. It's a real thing, even if it isn't expressed in law, that stands between women and the kind of jobs that they see men getting. And you can see beyond it, but you can't always get beyond it. I researched the etymology or the coining of this term as I was writing this talk. And it's a word that actually was coined in 1979. That was later than I thought it might have been. And I guess this is when the first advances of modern feminism were starting to be seen in the workplace. But women were starting to see it wasn't quite getting them far enough. So 1979 is an interesting moment in the women's movement. And actually the term wasn't popularized until a Time magazine article in around 1986, in the mid-1980s. But it's still a term that resonates. You said all women know what it means. And it's a term that's used in the States also in the context of race in the workplace. If you are of a certain race, can you get further than a certain point? This is the kind of image that was very familiar to magazine readers in the 1970s. There are sort of more outrageous ones online, especially clothing advertising. And I suppose they have a kind of retro charm and we can smile about them, but it's still pretty shocking to think that this kind of advertising was being done, certainly in my lifetime and in the lifetime of many of us in this room. But if you were born after around, I don't know, 1970, 1973, I'm guessing this is when that advert was produced, this is the world that used to be. And this is the world that we're fighting. This is it must be an American. It is an American from California. This is a computer? You bet your sweet telex operator it is. Goodness me. Okay, and the thing about these attitudes, which is why you say all women know the term glass ceiling and why it's still relevant, is that they can fade, but they never quite go away. And this is why we always have to keep fighting for our rights. And that's a theme I'm going to return to in the context of education also. When I started teacher training regularly around 5 years ago, so this is quite a recent phase in my life, I developed a model for unplugged teaching, which I started to use on my courses. And I'd like to share it with you now. I'll describe it for you. It's based on a sort of radial chart of the kind that you can see in PowerPoint presentations, where you have a central idea and then things spread from there. All right, so you imagine almost like ripples in water. If you drop in a stone, what's the first impact? And then what spreads from there? And so if the idea was teaching unplugged, then the first ripple is what we identified, Scott and myself, as the 3 principles of teaching unplugged. The idea that lessons should be conversation-driven and materials light and focused on emergent language. When that book was published was when I was asked first to do teacher training. And that's what I took with me into my first teacher training courses. And as I spoke to teachers, I realized that this approach had big implications for how we think about teaching, how we think about teacher training. Because if we want our lessons to be conversation-driven, we need to be flexible with our timings, as I said before. We can't just keep to a railway timetable lesson plan. If we want our lessons to be materials light, then we need to move down from the idea of delivering content, top-down content, and we need to move into the idea of user-generated content, which is the basis of Web 2.0. It's the basis of the digital tools that we use every day, the idea that we produce our own content and we share it and we can go for information anywhere we like, pretty much any time we like. So we move from top-down content, the classic example of which is sticking to the course book, only doing the course book, which is not something I'm sure that we do as teachers, but it is done in classrooms. If you observe teachers, you will see teachers sticking to the course book. Yeah? So we go from top down to bottom up. And if we're going to focus on emergent language, then we need to think about noting down and recording what happens in class very carefully so that we can hold on to it. If we're basing much of our teaching on conversation and interaction, we need to keep a hold of that as it happens. In the old days, I'm talking about 20 years ago when I was first experimenting with this in the classroom, it was pen and paper. And I still like using pen and paper because it's quick and it's easy. It never breaks. I'm the only one that can read my own handwriting though, so it kind of keeps all the responsibility with me. But now we have tools that can help us in the classroom. An interactive whiteboard, for example, if you have one, and a regular blackboard or whiteboard or a flip chart will do it equally well, can become a space where not only you as the teacher, but the learners can start to make notes and to record what's happening. And because this is so important, I found that I was spending more time after the lesson recording and noting down and trying to make sense of what had happened in the class than before the lesson. The planning before the lesson becomes a little less important, although thinking about activities, thinking about structure, thinking about flow is still essential. It's what happens after the lesson and then between the lessons that really counts. So these were three big challenges, and I realized this as I started to talk with teachers. And people's reaction to all this was very interesting. Hardly anyone said, "This is an amazing new idea." And we didn't either. We cross-reference this kind of teaching extensively in the book. And it's essentially a form of progressive education which is shaped for the ELT classroom. So nobody said, or hardly anyone said, "This is an amazing new idea." Hardly anyone said, "We hate this idea." And that was good because we didn't hate it either. But reactions tended to come in one of two forms. One was a slightly more positive reaction, which was, "This is great because it validates what I already do. This shows that when I move away from the syllabus, when I step back from the course book, when I really engage with my learners, I'm doing the right thing." Yep. And it gives teachers a reference point. Teaching Unplugged, which in turn is full of other reference points, which is the point of literature, the point of writing. So that was the more positive reaction. And the more equivocal reaction, not a negative reaction, but a more equivocal one, was, "I'd like to teach like this. I'd love to teach like this, but I don't think I can get away with it. I don't think it's possible within the structure." And one of the questions at the plenary panel yesterday articulated that very clearly. "I don't think I'm allowed to teach like this. I just don't think I can do it." I was starting to feel optimistic at this point, and I thought, okay, if people feel wary about this, let's just build in more reference points within our own field of ELT, and let's draw parallels with the wider field of education as a whole, so that people can feel justified, so they can feel more confident. And I do this as a brainstorm when I train. It's always a great session. I say, well, what other approaches does unplugged teaching make you think about? And when we think about our own field of ELT, people mention task-based learning and strong-form communicative language teaching, community language teaching, and the lexical approach, among others. When we move outside the specifics of ELT, people talk about educators like Paulo Freire in Brazil, John Dewey a century ago in the States, and all sorts of names, often names associated with child-centered, with whole child education, like Steiner and Montessori, and in the UK, A.S. Neal, who started the Summerhill School. These names come up. And it reaches back to Jean-Jacques Rousseau. I went to a lovely talk by Jeff in Istanbul a couple of years ago, and he quoted Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the French Enlightenment philosopher. And it was so interesting to see his thoughts on education and to feel that resonance with what we now see as progressive education. And of course, people also take it right back to Socratic dialogue. It's very exciting to be able to mention Socrates in Greece. I can't really tell you how exciting it is. We went to the museum, as Maria mentioned, on Friday night, and it was terribly moving, actually, to suddenly feel I was in the home of all these people and ideas that I'd grown up with, that I'd lived with for so long. So it reaches all the way back to Socratic dialogue. And it's an exciting session, and I always learn from it. Dialogue is a key term, is a key theme that comes up, the idea of speaking with, not talking to or talking at, and the notions of whole child and holistic education, and the whole idea of experiential learning are themes which recur. And the names and the terms and the ideas kind of fall out of people's memory very often from quite a long way back, from courses they did, from degree courses. But these ideas aren't always alive in our classrooms. Many teachers instinctively like the idea of teaching unplugged. It resonates with their deepest sense of what it means to teach, and in a sense, the reasons why they became teachers, to work with people. But what I've learned from teacher training, and for me, the great learning has been working in different countries and on different continents and hearing the same feedback, is that although educators like the idea of teaching unplugged, they feel unable to apply it much of the time, or in some cases, any of the time. And this is despite the fact that they recognize that it has much in common with many theories of education which they find inspiring. Why can't they do it? Well, we touched on many of these themes in the plenary session yesterday. They talk about testing. They talk about having to submit lesson plans, not just the day before the lesson, but a week before the lesson, or a month before the lesson, or months before a semester begins. Teachers worry about assessment, not just assessment of students, but also assessment of teachers, assessment of ourselves. It's not surprising when exam results are used to calculate everything from school league tables to teachers' performance-related pay. And when teachers can be fined for not working to the plan. It's also true that learner motivation for learning English is changing. We talked a lot yesterday about parental pressure, almost extrinsic motivation within the family. But as learners grow older, their motivation changes and has changed within my working lifetime. People are much less likely when they come to London for language courses, for example, to cite cultural exchange as a reason for learning English. They're much more likely to cite the jobs market. They need it for work. But the danger is that we take this instrumental reason for learning English and make it the only reason for learning English and build all of our pedagogy around that one need, which includes qualifications and then leads to jobs. I noticed a banner outside a large college of higher education in London on Tuesday night. I just watched a football game with my son, and our team had lost, and I was already not in a great mood. And then I saw a banner which advertised the name of the college, which is a college I've trained at, followed by the home of IELTS. Yeah? Not the home of English, or the home of learning, or the home of communication. No image of people talking in a friendly manner, just IELTS. And maybe that's good business, but, and I'm thinking of the global trend towards testing at a younger and younger age, it's bad culture. It disassociates education from the broader purposes of society. And an analogy came to mind, which I hope won't be offensive to anyone, but I imagine seeing a sign outside a church which read, "Church, the home of the communion wafer." It's an important part of what happens in church, but it's not the whole story, and nor are exams. I mentioned the Brazilian educator Paulo Freire, and he talked about a banking model of education, a handing down, a depositing of knowledge from teacher to student. He talked about students being given the opportunity only to file the information away. That was the only thing they were empowered to do. And he talks very beautifully about people being filed away as they do this. So as we file, we are filed. Bad news for people, maybe good news if you make filing systems. But I believe that as teachers, we are also filed away as we become administrators for delivery-led education. We become as disempowered as the students. We're not in a good place here. And I now think that I was missing something in that model that I talked to you about, that ripple model where we start with the principles of teaching unplugged and the implications and then the reference points. Because I think the limitations on our teaching kick in pretty soon, and they kick in pretty hard, almost as soon as we really consider the implications of being conversation-driven, being materials light, and focusing on emergent language. And that's what I'm calling the class ceiling. We can see the potential of teaching unplugged, and we can perceive its roots in progressive education, but we're getting stopped before we can reach any of this. Because the people who maintain the class ceiling really aren't interested in those things that we see beyond it. They think like business people. They want results. They want accountability, and they want efficiency. About 18 months ago, the publisher Pearson introduced a new product which they called Efficacy. And if you ever go to the Pearson website or Google Pearson Efficacy, you'll find a very good example of efficiency discourse operating in education. The idea of efficacy is to allow people around the world to report the effectiveness of Pearson's biggest courses and learning aids with the same transparency as they file financial accounts. And the chief executive of Pearson, John Fallon, said, "It will vary business by business, product by product, country to country, but for everyone, there will need to be an externally verifiable measure." For everyone. Everything is awesome. Sorry, I just added that. A measure for everyone. Bad news for people, very good news for measurement systems, especially if the companies who run the measurement systems also publish the course books, especially if the companies who run the measurement systems and publish the course books start investing in their own schools. That's called a monopoly. I think there's a big but that comes into our hearts when we think about all this as teachers. It doesn't sit well with our principles. It doesn't sit well with what we take to the classroom every day. We came into the profession because we wanted to break down the glass ceiling or the glass ceilings in society. And here we are facing one of our own. And I sense that it's closing in on us. It's almost a ceiling in a spy movie that comes down. And you're thinking, how can I get out of here? It's squeezing the space that we have to respond to student needs. It's squeezing the space that they have to explore. It's affecting teachers and parents and children. Here's a letter from a teacher in London, published in the Independent newspaper last year. This teacher wrote, "The desire to bring up compassionate young adults who are capable of thinking and who have a sense of perspective has been sacrificed. Children are being brought up to see passing exams as the sole purpose of school." Here's a student voice. Here's a quote. "School should not be about passing tests to get more funding. School should be about learning, understanding, thinking critically, and finding something that you're passionate about." I'm sure we'd agree with that. Those are the words of a New York State student in the US called Amber Kudler, who was asked as a 17 or 18-year-old to do a graduation speech as a valedictorian. And she surprised her school principal by using that opportunity to criticize standardized testing. I think it's a very brave thing to do. Education is a shared enterprise. We also need to think critically as educators. It's not just for our students that it matters. And we also need to nourish our own passion. It's not just a one-way street where we're constantly nurturing. We need to look after ourselves. So I'd invite you to look up at the class ceiling or the glass ceiling and think what you could do and how far you could go with a little more time to teach, a little less paperwork to complete, a little more freedom to explore. Listen to that inner teacher's voice and to the voices around you. Do you remember that quote I gave you at the start with a blank? When it becomes a revolutionary act to, we're in trouble. Any ideas? Educate. To dream. To think. Yeah, well, you've got there ahead of me. The actual quote is from an American dietitian, and he says, when it becomes a revolutionary act to eat real food, we're in trouble. And you've got there before me. I would say when it becomes a revolutionary act to teach, we're in trouble. The tag, when I saw this poster, was Occupy Food. I'm quite good at occupying food, a bit too good. But I also think it applies to education. When it becomes a revolutionary act to teach, we're in trouble. So how do we start to do this? I need to check the time. Part 2 of my talk is about what I started to see around me as I went on this journey as a teacher trainer. And it's called The Spark in the Park. And I'll start with a quote from a wonderful Uruguayan writer called Eduardo Galeano. This is from a book called We Say No. I imagine that might resonate with you in Greece at this time. Democracy and social justice have gotten divorced. Whoever would marry them lets loose the storm. Okay, well, perhaps this is part of the storm. I'm just scrolling, I'm sorry, it's gone back to the start. Here we go. I'd like to give you another little puzzle. We teachers recognize this as a gap fill, but it really is a puzzle. It's a little game. And actually, this is one of my favorite unplugged activities. It's just the same as when it becomes a revolutionary Act 2 blank. What do you think might be the missing words here? This is somebody talking about society. And this person says, they don't like blank because blank don't generate a profit. And just have a think what it could be. They don't like blank because blank don't generate a profit. Even the smallest blank, this is turning into a proper gap fill, isn't it, are now seen as a possibility for investment. We'll come back to all of that. Okay, so this part of my journey began in May 2011, and I arrived in Barcelona to teach a live lesson with Scott at a conference that the Teacher Development SIG organized, and it was called the Unplugged Conference. And on the evening I arrived, there was a big protest going on in Plaza Catalunya in Barcelona, which is where you get off the bus from the airport. It was absolutely full of people making a tremendous noise. And we actually used this in our live lesson the next morning because we didn't know what was going on. We asked the students, what is happening here? It was the very beginning of what became known as the indignance movement. So this is spring 2011. And this was also the days of the Arab Spring. Later that year, in September, the Occupy movement took over Zuccotti Park in New York. The Occupy movement. So we're thinking about autumn 2011 now. And that year marked a shift in our discourse. Whatever our perspective on all of this, it became a shift in how politics and corporate culture were perceived and discussed. And austerity, corporations, banking and corruption were discussed and contested in new ways. Soon after, another park was in the headlines. I spoke at a conference in Turkey in April 2013, and the day after we left, riot police used water cannon and tear gas to prevent May Day marchers from reaching Taksim Square, and that was the start of the Gezi Park protests. That summer, I saw video footage of police storming a university where I'd been training with Burcu, one of our fellow plenary speakers here, just a few months before. And we were able to follow the tweets and updates of Turkish educators that we knew as they went on marches like this one. And here we see people pouring over the Bosphorus Bridge from Asia over to the European side of Istanbul to continue the protests. That same July, I found myself training in Recife in the north of Brazil, which is where Paulo Freire was from. And we spent the day talking about Paulo Freire and liberation education, if you like. And then we couldn't get home because the streets were blocked by protests. And when you've been talking about liberation education, you can't complain when you find that you can't get back to the hotel because of protests. So I started to kind of ask myself, what's going on here? I keep seeing this. And since then, I've spoken in Mexico, where speakers were told not to leave the hotel because of protests on the street. And now I'm here. Now, I took a photo, which I haven't been able to get across here, because from the hotel window yesterday, we saw a protest march. And I thought, wow, even here, as I finished writing this talk, there's a protest going on right under my eyes. And this was a poster which we rather stole from a lamppost. But this was the march, and it's an anti-fascist, anti-racist march with a very nice image of different races holding hands in fellowship. So what's my point? I've said that I think we're in trouble in our schools, in education, and I think it's clear to all of us as we think of our own situation here, or your situation, and the situation that many of our fellow people in other countries face, that society is also in crisis. But the plan that most governments have for education, which is to make everyone accountable and to measure everything and to separate all subjects from each other before dividing them into tiny testable chunks, is only going to make the situation that we have in society worse. because it's a model that says economics is everything. It's a model that says the point of education is to prepare children for the economy. But as people in Spain might say, as people in Brazil may very soon say, and as people in Greece have just said with their voices and their votes, what economy? Whose economy? We need to educate children not just to contribute to the economy, but to survive it. We need to educate children not just to survive the economy, but one day to challenge it, to change a model that places consumerism at the heart of life, even when people can't afford to consume. A few weeks ago, a couple of months ago, it was Martin Luther King Day, and I was trying to find one of his speeches for my daughter. She was very busy sticking stickers into her Frozen album. So I don't really know if she got much of Martin Luther King's famous speech, I Have a Dream. Perhaps the only thing that stuck was Olaf and Elsa. But I was trying. You know how we are as parents when we're teachers also. We can't stop teaching. But I also found a later speech by Martin Luther King, 4 years after his famous I Have a Dream speech, where he actually became more radical. And this is a speech he made in April 1967, 47 years ago next month. And he said, "We must rapidly begin the shift from a thing-oriented society to a person-oriented society. Are machines and computers, profit motives and property rights considered more important than people?" I'm so sorry, I've jumped. I don't want to misquote Dr. King. Dr. King speaking in April 1967, "We must rapidly begin the shift from a thing-oriented society to a person-oriented society. When machines and computers, profit motives and property rights are considered more important than people, the giant triplets of racism, extreme materialism and militarism are incapable of being conquered." It was 47 years ago. 47 years, and have we begun the shift from a thing-oriented society to a person-oriented society? Are machines and computers, profit motives and property rights still considered more important than people? I guess those are rhetorical questions from where I'm standing, at any rate. Where's the relevance to education? I felt a relevance. I felt direct connections here. But in a way, I wanted to be sure. And we don't have to look too far. In fact, we can find the links between democracy, which is really what we're talking about, true democracy, and education, expressed very clearly in Article 26 of the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights. There are 3 clauses, and I want to focus on the second one. And it reads as follows: "Education shall be directed to the full development of the human personality," thinking of Agnes' plenary yesterday morning, "and to the strengthening of respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms." It says it in black and white. "Education shall promote understanding, tolerance, and friendship among all nations, racial or religious groups, and shall further the activities of the United Nations for the maintenance of peace." It's almost shocking to read those words in the current educational climate. It's so far from the narrow definition of education we increasingly observe today, school as the home of exams. For another clear articulation of the link between progressive education and society, we can go back a century to John Dewey's book, Democracy and Education, published in 1916. And he wrote this: "Democracy cannot flourish where the chief influences in selecting subject matter for instruction are utilitarian ends narrowly conceived for the masses, and for the higher education of the few, the traditions of a specialized cultivated class. The notion that the essentials of elementary education are the 3 R's, which are writing, reading, and arithmetic, mechanically treated, is based upon ignorance of the essentials needed for realization of democratic ideals. Again, those words resonate down the years, 100 years almost. And my question is, what can we do about this? Yeah, that was really what Stephen Krashen was arguing or asking during his plenary and during the panel discussion. What can we do about this? Let's think back to the people on the streets in all those different countries, including this one, who've been using their voices to protest. And let's go back to the puzzle I set to you. They don't like because don't generate a profit. Any ideas? They don't like blank because blank don't generate a profit. Critical thinking, because critical thinkers don't generate a profit. They don't like schools. Okay, in a classroom, you could run with those ideas. You could say, well, what if it was critical thinking? What if it was schools? And you could develop a whole alternative narrative in a way. Well, that was very decontextualized. That was a bit of a test question. Huh? In real life, we always know who's speaking and what they're speaking about. And in this case, it's the former head gardener of Gezi Park in Istanbul, a 68-year-old man called Cemal Öze, and he apparently knows every inch of the park by heart and remembers every tree he planted. And he's quoted in The Guardian last year as asking, what is it with this government's love for concrete? Not just the Turkish government. When I started, this park was a huge garden, green and full of flowers I'd grown myself. And he actually said they don't like trees, because trees don't generate a profit. Even the smallest city gardens and parks are now seen as a possibility for investment. A park is a space for relaxation, a space for reflection, a space for recuperation. A park is where we take a break from routine, where we stretch out, where we play. It allows us to be ourselves instead of playing a role or being somebody at work. No one's monitoring us. Well, they shouldn't be. It's a very nice metaphor, actually, for time in class spent away from the syllabus. But as I've said, that time and that space is increasingly under threat. Classrooms are also increasingly seen as a suitable place for investment. That was the point Krashen was making yesterday when he talked about technology and who's behind it. People in Istanbul made the connection between green space and other freedoms that were being eroded. They said, you're taking so much away, and now you're going to take this as well, and they marched. Well, I think we need to stand up for our rights as educators too. How might we protest? It might be seizing an occasion to make an argument. That was what Amba Kudla, the 17-year-old student in the States, did. She was asked to make a valedictorian speech. She didn't want to. And when she was persuaded to, she said, okay, I'm going to attack standardized testing. And it's a wonderful speech. Amba Kudla is the name. You might have a workshop at school if you want to talk about these issues and you want to get people talking about them. It might be simply about being very careful about the vocabulary we use. Chomsky talks about changing the terms of the discourse. Yeah? If we resist business vocabulary as applied to education, then we stand up for our own rights, even when we speak, even when we think about our work. Parents are not stakeholders. They're parents. Learning can't be delivered. This isn't a business. I also think about everyday action in the classroom. The idea that, again, Stephen mentioned yesterday, of doing something better instead of something worse, I think, or something good instead of something bad. He talked about 5 minutes a day. Sounds like a fitness exercise regime, doesn't it? 5 minutes a day. I recently saw a Facebook update about a talk that was given at the IATEFL Slovenia conference by a teacher who works in FIRAM. And in this talk, she said teachers can be fined for deviating from the lesson plan. And I was interested in this, and I tried to find out who it was, and it turned out it was a teacher that I'd trained, actually. I'd been on an unplugged course, and she was one of the participants. Her name is Dragica Zradevska, and we've just been emailing a little bit since. And I asked her about the laws there, and she translated them for me into English. And the laws there enable the government or the education department to fine a teacher 3 times their monthly salary for failing to complete a lesson plan. That means failing to deliver a lesson plan before the lesson, but it also sets up this punitive system whereby if an inspector comes and sees a teacher who has done a lesson plan but moves away from it, thank you so much, they can get a warning and then they can get this fine, 3 times their salary. Yeah? And when she emailed me, she said, I hope this will be helpful and I hope you will get some insight into the situation here and my outcry and determination to beat the system. Great words, huh? Strong words. My outcry, my determination, the spark in the park. You know, the gardener's right. I said it wasn't just the Turkish government. Even the smallest city gardens and parks are now seen as a possibility for investment all over the world. There's a Gezi Park in every city. And because our space is also under threat, I would say this. There's a park in every classroom. I'm going to move on to the third part of my talk now. And I want us to approach it in an optimistic, hopeful point of view. I know there will be different opinions in the room about the new government here, but for someone outside Greece looking on and seeing a government democratically elected and saying positive and strong things about social justice, it's been inspiring. So let's approach this last part of the talk positively and with a quote again from Eduardo Galeano, which I'll just leave for you to read. Could be the destruction of a park, or any negative act can be countered by a human act. Agni, what did you say about human beings yesterday? That we're indestructible? What was your word? We're tough. We're born for difficulty. Yeah? We're designed for adversity. Well, here's a lovely expression of that in that quote. Okay, assembly. Some of this is in my abstract, so you'll forgive me if I walk a little quickly through some of this. I'm going to skip one slide, which I hate to do, and I'm going to move on to one of the ideas that I've had for at least changing the discourse, for thinking about what might be possible in our classrooms. And I've called this 50 free. It's a nice word to look at. It's a hard word to say. And the idea behind 50 free is that we realize that we're bound to have to make compromises. I guess this has been the experience of the new government to an extent. You can say this is what I believe and this is what I plan to do, but we're not alone in the world and we have to face the realities of the system. Now, yesterday Stephen said one way to counter this is to do things anonymously. He said even if you're in a job where you might not want to speak your mind, you can comment on a blog and you can use an anonymous name if you want to. Or you can do things quietly in your class. So it may be that this idea is way too big, but nothing wrong with big ideas. At least they might make you think. And my idea is based on hope and it's based on compromise. It's based on the idea that we can reclaim some of the space in our classes, not because we think it's a nice idea, but because it's actually what we're supposed to do as teachers. It's what we're supposed to do as educators, and it's what we need to do if we want our schools to contribute to our society and to democracy in a meaningful way. But I'm also being practical and pragmatic. I'm saying there will always be exams, and there's nothing wrong with exams in principle, and there's nothing wrong with testing. It's how you do it, when you do it, how often you do it. Yeah, there's nothing wrong with teacher assessment. There's nothing wrong with standards, but it's how it's applied. And so I'm saying 50% of what happens in the class can be observed by outside assessors. 50% of the time in our classes can be spent on preparing for exams, preparing for the test. 50% can be whatever the education department wants us to do, because we have to do it anyway. But I'm saying let's try and find freedom in the other half of the lesson. And I understand that 50% is a big number. Maybe it should be 15 free, a quarter of an hour. Maybe, as was suggested yesterday, it should be 5 free, 5 minutes. But I do believe that we need to fight. We need to fight for our rights as educators. You know, I heard a new expression in a meeting the other week. I don't know if any of you have heard it. Somebody in this meeting said, we've got a hard stop at 3:30. Have you heard that? It's the first time. We've got a hard stop at 3:30. And he meant we have to go at 3:30. This meeting must end at 3:30. So if you want to sound important, you can use that expression. But there's no hard stop for freedom. There's no deadline. We keep working on it. When I introduced this idea at TESOL last year, at the Teacher Development Day, a teacher came up after the presentation, and she was from Bangladesh, and she said, I'm going to go and do 50 free. She didn't say, how do you do it? She didn't tell me what she was going to do. She just said, I'm going to do it. And that's one of the things that made me think maybe there is some merit in this simple idea. Because it's do what you have to do and then do what you must do as an educator. I don't know if she did it, and I don't think it would be easy to do for all the reasons that I've outlined today. But I think we need to argue for an education in which students and teachers are both empowered, in which we all have a voice, in which students and teachers both have agency. They have the ability to do things, to choose what is done. And we need an education in which acts in the classroom are validated not by their adherence to a national curriculum or an exam syllabus, but by their impact on students and therefore their impact on society. We can't do this if our educational model is a passive one. Well, we're getting close to our own hard stop now. I don't know if I've missed a 5 minutes to go sign, but it can't be long. And I want to revisit the title of this talk, Assembly. And when I started to play with this word, I liked it because it had at least 3 different resonances for me. One idea of assembly is the idea of just putting things together, building things, constructing something. And the idea of unplugged teaching is consonant with constructed learning, co-constructed learning, where you build yourselves from what students bring to class, and you use your intuition as a teacher to help them build. Another meaning of assembly is the one that I've spoken a lot about in the middle of this talk, of people getting together in public to protest. We think of peaceful assembly, the right to peaceful assembly, and in the UK there is a law against riotous assembly. And in the UK, centuries ago, they passed a law saying that if more than 12 people were in riotous assembly, they had to be dispersed when somebody read aloud the Riot Act. I don't know if you know the idiom, reading the Riot Act, as in really telling someone off. The teacher says, I'm going to read them the Riot Act tomorrow. The origin of that is in telling a crowd of people in the street that they must go home. Getting together in public to express a point of view can be a very dangerous business. It isn't dangerous in the UK. It can be difficult, but in some countries it can be a matter of life and death. And of course, the third meaning of assembly, which might be the first one that came to mind for you when you saw the abstract, is the beginning of the school day. The idea of everyone in the school meeting together to talk about something, to think about something inspirational. And I think this idea of togetherness relates very directly and very powerfully to the notion of community. We have an amazing opportunity when we bring people together in a building, face to face, at the heart of our communities. Think of how we spend so much time on our own devices, looking down like this, ignoring even the people we love most sometimes. Yeah, but we have this chance to bring children together. But, and I said this during the plenary discussion yesterday, the panel discussion, as soon as we bring children together in school, we separate them. From a very early age, from the end of nursery onwards, we set them at tables and we divide the day by subject as if there were no history to maths and no geography and poetry. And we say, get your heads down. That's what people say in the UK. Concentrate, get your head down. Heads down. You're not at nursery anymore. And pretty soon it's heads down. You've got an exam coming up. And then it's heads down, you don't want to be like all those people who never got their heads down. And then the people who did well at school and the people who dropped out of school get further and further apart as they grow into adult life. What can bring us together? How can we get our heads up again and make that the point of school? Well, I believe protest could take place in the classroom, and I think we've had lovely examples of that, thinking of ways to make classroom life meaningful. I believe our teaching could become our protest. And I'm not talking about going into class with a poster like this. I'm talking about thinking deeply about how we teach, how we talk about teaching, what we say to other educators, what we say to the people who manage teaching. Because I believe that teaching is a human right. Simple as that. If we go back to Article 26 of the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, it says a lot about education. Let me remind you, we're so nearly done. Education shall be directed to the full development of the human personality and to the strengthening of respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms. Yes, education is a human right, but if we don't have the freedom to teach, it becomes meaningless. We can't meet the ideals of Article 26 by adhering to a curriculum at all times. We can't do it if we direct all our efforts and all the efforts of our students into the next test. We need to state clearly that teaching is a human right. To teach to the heights, we need to know our rights. If we truly directed education to the full development of the human personality and to the strengthening of respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms, our role and the role of schools would change beyond measure. It would move beyond measurement. And perhaps, as I suggested in my abstract, we could start to see schools not as the places where we prepare our children for society, but where we start to prepare our society for children. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. It's a pleasure. Thank you. That's lovely. Thank you. Sorry about the microphone. Thank you so much.